The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like a machine counting down to something. Laura Bennett moved through the corridors of Mercy General with the kind of efficiency that made her invisible, the way she positioned her body slightly smaller than it actually was, the way she kept her eyes on the work instead of on people's faces, the way she said "excuse me" instead of "move." 12 years of being seen had taught her that 13 years of not being seen was easier. The morning shift began at 6:58. She clocked in at 6:57. Her scrubs were navy blue, hospital-issued, wrinkled from the dryer in her apartment complex's basement. Her badge hung from a lanyard she'd bought at Target, nothing with a unit emblem, nothing with a name that might connect to anything before Houston. Her hands, as she pulled on latex gloves in the medication station, carried the kind of scars that didn't match a nursing degree from the past 4 years. 3 thin parallel lines across her left knuckles. A burn mark shaped like a cigarette on her right wrist. A surgical scar along the inside of her forearm that she kept covered with compression sleeves. "Morning, Laura." Michelle from day shift handed off the tablet with tonight's patient roster. Room for 12 is post-op from a spinal fusion. Room for 18 is stable but needs vitals every 2 hours. Room for 23, Michelle paused, her lips tightening slightly. New admission. 84-year-old male, scheduled for cardiac catheterization tomorrow. He's been asking for water since intake. Thanks. Laura took the tablet. That was the kind of conversation she'd learned to have. No elaboration. No personal commentary. Just the facts that mattered. Just the work. The hallway stretched out before her in the pale pre-dawn light that made everything in the hospital look like it belonged to a world that hadn't quite finished being created. Antiseptic and stale coffee. The ventilator in 412 wheezed its mechanical rhythm. The heart monitor in 418 beeped its steady rhythm, 72 beats per minute, sinus rhythm, stable. Laura had learned to find comfort in those sounds. They were simpler than people. They told you exactly what they meant. She had chosen this hospital for the specific reason that it was big enough that nobody would notice her, and small enough that it wasn't a teaching hospital where military medical consultants occasionally showed up to lecture on trauma protocols. Mercy General had 216 beds, a decent trauma unit, and a night shift nursing staff that was too tired to ask questions about where you'd been before you arrived in Houston with a transfer request and a clean employment history. The combat boot stayed in her trunk. Room for 23 was at the far end of the hall. Laura knocked twice, softly, and pushed the door open with her hip, a habit that saved her hands from touching anything unnecessary. The man in the bed was old in the way that comes from living through too many years of physical labor. His hair was white but military short. His forearms had the kind of tan that only comes from decades in the sun. He was staring out the window at the parking lot, where a few streetlights still glowed against the lightening sky. "Good morning," Laura said. "I'm Laura. I'm going to be checking your vitals every 2 hours until the night shift ends. Is there anything you need right now?" The man turned to look at her. His eyes were pale blue, the color of winter light. He studied her for a moment, not in the way that doctors did, cataloging symptoms, but in the way that soldiers did, reading posture and calluses and the space someone held around themselves. "Water," he said finally. "And maybe some information about what time my catheterization is scheduled." 11 o'clock, Laura said. She was already moving toward the bathroom, already filling a plastic cup with ice water. "Dr. Hargrove will be doing the procedure. He's one of the best interventional cardiologists in Houston." She set the water on the bedside table, close enough that he could reach it without straining. "You'll need to be NPO, nothing by mouth, starting at midnight tonight. No food, no water after that." "I can read," the man said. There was no rudeness in it. Just fact, delivered like a diagnosis. "I was given a bracelet and a pamphlet and a lecture from someone who seemed to think I didn't understand English." Laura almost smiled. She didn't. The pamphlet is probably more accurate than the lecture. "Get some rest. I'll be back in 2 hours." She left the room before he could ask her anything else. That was the rule she'd built her Houston life around: be helpful, be competent, be invisible, and leave before anyone had a reason to ask where you came from. The break room on the 3rd floor smelled like burnt coffee and the ghost of someone's tuna sandwich. Laura sat at the small table near the window with her thermos of tea, chamomile, nothing with caffeine, and tried to focus on the schedule for the next week. Susan was off Thursday. That meant the unit would be short one experienced nurse, which meant the workload would compress, which meant she'd be exhausted by the time she had to drive to the VA hospital for her 4:00 appointment. "Morning, Laura." Christine from Pediatrics breezed in, grabbed a mug from the cabinet, and filled it with coffee that looked like motor oil. Then she saw Laura sitting at the table and her expression shifted microscopically, the way it did when you were trying to decide whether to acknowledge someone or pretend you hadn't seen them. Christine chose pretend. She filled her mug, added a packet of artificial sweetener, and left. Laura didn't watch her go. She'd learned not to. By 8:00, the morning sun was so bright it hurt to look at it directly. Laura stood at the medication station on the 3rd floor and prepared the morning doses: metoprolol for 412, aspirin for 418, nitroglycerine for 423. Her hands moved through the motions without her having to think about them. That was muscle memory. That was what 13 years of being good at something brought you, the ability to do it with a conscious part of your mind somewhere else entirely. The elevator doors opened at the far end of the corridor. A man stepped out. He was in his late 50s, with the kind of expensive watch that announced itself from across a room and the kind of posture that came from knowing that people would make space for you without you having to ask. He was carrying a leather portfolio and wearing a suit that probably cost more than Laura made in a month. This was Dr. Gerald Hargrove, Chief of Cardiology and Vice President of Hospital Operations for Mercy General. He walked the corridor like he owned it. He probably did, in a sense. He had the board's ear. He had relationships. He had the kind of quiet power that came from knowing exactly how deep your network ran and being confident that you could activate it if you needed to. Laura kept her eyes on the medication station. She did not look up as he passed. "Bennett." His voice was the sound of someone testing whether you would respond to your name. She responded. She looked up. "I wanted to introduce myself." "You're relatively new to the unit, aren't you?" "For months." "Yes, sir." Laura set down the medication she'd been holding. Her hand stayed still. Neutral. The way a soldier stands at ease, alert but not rigid. "Where did you transfer from?" He was still holding the portfolio. He didn't seem like he was planning to leave soon. "San Diego," Laura said. Which was true. She'd been in San Diego for 3 years before Houston. She didn't mention what she'd been doing there, or before that, or the 13 years before that. And before San Diego. "Various postings," Laura said. The word postings was a test. It was either innocuous enough to pass unnoticed, or it was a flag, a word that suggested someone who understood the language of structure and hierarchy and assignment. She watched his face to see which interpretation he arrived at. Dr. Hargrove smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Well, we're glad to have you. Mercy General has very high standards. We'd like to make sure that everyone who works here, particularly in critical care, maintains those standards." He opened the portfolio just enough that Laura could see the edge of a printed document. "We have quarterly reviews coming up. I'm sure you'll find that our expectations are clearly articulated." "I understand, sir." "Good." He closed the portfolio. "Welcome to Mercy General, Ms. Bennett." He left before she could respond. Laura stood very still at the medication station, her hand still resting on the counter. The ventilator in 412 wheezed. The heart monitor in 418 beeped. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like they were counting something down. At 2:00, she picked up her car keys from her locker. The locker was narrow and deep and held nothing personal, no photos, no plants, no decorations. Just her street clothes and her phone charger and, on the very bottom, tucked under the false floor she'd installed herself, a pair of boots. They were old. The leather had cracked in places. The soles were worn through in the heel where she'd walked across 2 provinces in the summer heat of 2019. They smelled like dust and memory and the part of her life that she'd decided, for years ago, to leave behind. She didn't touch them. She closed the locker and left. The VA hospital in downtown Houston was a 30-minute drive from Mercy General. Laura sat in the waiting room at 4 o'clock sharp, surrounded by men and women in various states of trauma recovery. One man had a service dog. One woman was missing her left arm below the elbow. One older man stared at the wall with the kind of 1,000-yard stare that meant he was somewhere other than Houston, probably somewhere in the 1980s, probably somewhere in a conflict that nobody talked about anymore. Laura had treated soldiers like this in Helmand Province. She had sutured their wounds and pushed medications and called in medevac helicopters that arrived too late more times than she could count. Now she sat in a waiting room among them, waiting to talk to a therapist about insomnia and nightmares and the specific flavor of guilt that comes from surviving when other people didn't. Laura Bennett. A woman in navy scrubs held a clipboard. Laura stood. She followed the woman down a corridor that looked almost identical to the one at Mercy General, same fluorescent lights, same antiseptic smell, same sense that the building was holding its breath. Dr. Margaret Chen's office was small and comfortable and had a window that looked out over the parking lot. There were plants on the windowsill. There was a box of tissues on the side table. There were all the things that were supposed to make you feel safe when you were talking about the things that had broken you. "How have you been sleeping?" Dr. Chen asked. 3 to 4 hours per night, Laura said. Interrupted. "Nightmares?" "Yes." Laura's hands were very still in her lap. "Same ones." "The compound." "The compound," Laura confirmed. 2019, Helmand Province. A coordinated attack on a forward operating base where she'd been operating a field surgical unit. 17 wounded. 4 of them she could have saved with better equipment, better timing, better luck. Instead, she'd amputated limbs to stop the bleeding and made decisions about who got the morphine and who didn't, and she'd been very good at her job, which meant she'd become very efficient at triage and very skilled at accepting that some people were going to die on her hands no matter what she did. "I think," Dr. Chen said slowly, "that we should talk about whether you're ready to come back to some form of military-adjacent work. Consulting, perhaps. Or teaching. Something that lets you." "No." Laura's answer was immediate. It was also the most emphatic thing she'd said all week. Dr. Chen waited. "I left that life for a reason," Laura said. "I'm not going back." "But you're not moving forward either," Dr. Chen said gently. "You're in stasis. You're in a nursing role that doesn't challenge you, you're living in an apartment without any personal effects, you're not maintaining relationships with anyone from your past, and you're sitting in my office once a week telling me that you're managing your symptoms but you're not healing." Laura didn't respond. Outside, the sun was beginning to set. The parking lot was filling with evening shadows. "The waiting room," Dr. Chen continued, "is full of people like you. People who are carrying the same weight you're carrying. People who could benefit from someone like you, who understands what they've been through. The waiting room is full of people who deserve better than someone who isn't stable enough to help them," Laura said. "Right now, I'm stable enough to not hurt anyone. That's the best I can offer." Dr. Chen made a note in her file. She didn't look up. "Your appointment next week is at the same time. Will you still be in Houston?" "Yes," Laura said. "I'm not leaving." She meant it. She had no intention of leaving Houston or her nursing job or her apartment with the hidden boots in the trunk of her car. She had no intention of going back to the life she'd left behind. The PTSD was manageable now, not gone, but manageable. That was success. That was all she was aiming for. She had no way of knowing that the old man in room for 23 had spent 37 years as an Army Ranger. She had no way of knowing that his son was a Marine colonel. She had no way of knowing that in exactly 4 days, that old man was going to stand in the lobby of Mercy General and collapse, and she was going to respond to it, and everything she'd built in Houston was going to come apart. For now, she drove home through the Houston evening traffic. She parked her car in the narrow lot behind her apartment building. She climbed the stairs to her third-floor unit. She unlocked the door. She sat on the couch in the darkness, she didn't turn on the lights, and she let the nightmares wait for sleep to arrive. Outside her window, the city hummed with the sound of people living lives that connected them to other people. Laura sat in the dark and listened to the sound of her own breathing. She was stable. She was managing. She was alive. That was enough. The corridor tiles at Mercy General reflected the fluorescent glow in streaks, and Laura pushed a medication cart past the fourth-floor nursing station when Dr. Hargrove stepped directly into her path. His cologne arrived before his words, something expensive and suffocating. He held a chart against his chest, his expression arranged into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Nurse Bennett," he said, his voice carrying the kind of measured casualness that made her spine straighten. "I was reviewing your transfer paperwork. Quite the scattered history. 3 hospitals in 5 years. Makes one wonder." He paused, letting the implication settle. "Are you running from something, or just unable to hold a position?" The question landed in front of 2 residents and a nursing assistant. Laura's hands remained steady on the cart. She took one measured breath, the kind that came from holding wounded soldiers in desert sand while mortars fell. Her eyes met his for exactly 2 seconds, and she said, "I prefer working where I can be useful, doctor," before moving the cart forward. He didn't step aside so much as she navigated around him, her shoulder nearly brushing his lab coat. His laugh followed her down the corridor, not genuine, but meant to be heard. The nursing assistant turned away. One resident suddenly found the floor very interesting. 2 days later, the supply chain audit meeting consumed the third-floor conference room at 2:22 p.m. 15 people sat around the massive oak table, administrators, finance officers, department heads. Laura sat near the back, her notebook open to a blank page. Hargrove sat 3 chairs from the hospital's chief financial officer, Gerald Whitmore, a man whose rings caught the light every time his hands moved. "We're reviewing protocol deviations," Whitmore announced, tapping his pen against printed reports. "Questions about inventory procedures, specifically from the nursing floors." Hargrove leaned forward. "I've been concerned about inconsistencies. The new staff sometimes don't understand proper chain of custody." He glanced at Laura directly. "For instance, when requesting controlled medications, there are specific forms. Shortcuts can create audit problems for everyone." Laura hadn't taken any shortcuts. She'd worked trauma units long enough to know that paperwork was the skeleton holding up the system. But she said nothing. "Actually," Hargrove continued, speaking to Whitmore but performing for the room, "I wonder if some nurses are simply unfamiliar with Mercy General's standards. Transfers from smaller facilities sometimes bring inconsistent practices." He adjusted his cufflinks, a $12,000 Omega Seamaster catching light like a blade. "We should probably implement additional verification steps for anyone with multiple previous positions." The CFO nodded, making a note. Laura wrote nothing in her notebook, but her grip on the pen tightened slightly. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song. Around the table, several people shifted uncomfortably. The compliance officer, a woman named Sandra who'd worked with Laura on the pediatric trauma wing, didn't make eye contact. When the meeting ended at 3:06 p.m., Hargrove caught up with Laura in the hallway outside the restroom. His voice dropped lower, meant for her alone. "You know, it's remarkable how much we can learn about someone's capabilities through their history," he said, his tone conversational. "Some nurses are content with what they know. Others seem always to be searching." He smiled that same smile. "I wonder which type you are." "I do my job," Laura said. "Do you?" His eyes traveled down her scrubs as if looking for evidence. "Because we have very specific expectations here. Competence, certainly, but also stability. Loyalty. Staying power." He paused. Some people aren't built for permanence. The break room at 4:38 p.m. had a coffee maker that produced something technically categorizable as coffee, a refrigerator humming in the corner, and 5 empty chairs. Laura had chosen the seat by the window, the one with a view of the parking lot and the street beyond. She'd been there 4 minutes when 3 nurses from the day shift walked in, saw her, exchanged glances, and left without taking anything. Alone again. By 6:15 p.m., the rumor had circulated far enough that she could feel it in the way people spoke around her. Nothing direct. Nothing actionable. Just the subtle repositioning of bodies when she approached, the way conversations died mid-sentence, the looks exchanged between nurses who hadn't previously shown any particular interest in her employment history. Sandra from compliance, the one who'd avoided eye contact, found her at the medication station as the evening shift began. "Laura," Sandra said quietly, "I just wanted to say, I hope things work out." She waited, clearly hoping for Laura to ask what she meant. Laura didn't. When Sandra left, she'd confirmed everything. Hargrove had called the board members. Probably Gerald Whitmore over drinks. Probably had mentioned something about inconsistent credentials and concerning transfer patterns, and we should verify her background more thoroughly. The kind of seeds that took root in institutional soil. By 8:51 p.m., the shifts had fully rotated. The night crew was skeleton, 14 nurses and 2 doctors covering 234 beds. Laura moved through the hospital with the same quiet efficiency she always used, but something had shifted. The oxygen had changed composition. The air tasted different. And then the intercom crackled, "Code blue, emergency room. All available personnel to ER. Code blue." The ER doors slammed open at 8:54 p.m., and the world became noise and motion. 2 stretchers arrived simultaneously, both with military personnel, one a young soldier maybe 23 years old with a compound fracture of the left femur, the other a man in his 50s wearing what remained of combat gear, his shirt soaked with blood from a penetrating chest wound. The wounded moved like maps of pain, their bodies writing stories in a language only certain people understood. Dr. Hargrove was already there, moving toward the older soldier with a scalpel and an air of command. He was competent in the way that textbooks were competent, technically correct, mechanically sound, completely missing the story the body was telling. "We need a chest tube," he announced, his hands already reaching for the insertion kit. Laura watched from the medication station. Watched his hand position. Watched where he marked for entry. Watched him miss the optimal intercostal space by nearly a centimeter. Watched him hesitate just slightly on the depth. Watched him place the tube in a location that would drain air but not the blood that was pooling around the soldier's right lung. The monitor showed oxygen saturation at 86%. Dropping. The young soldier on the second stretcher was conscious, eyes locked on something only he could see, his breathing rapid and shallow. One of the residents, a woman named Dr. Chen, competent but young, was trying to establish for access in his left arm. His veins were collapsing from blood loss. She couldn't find purchase. "Second line," she said, her voice climbing. "I need a second line now." The oxygen saturation on monitor 2, 81% and declining. The femur fracture meant he was bleeding internally, losing volume by the minute. The math was simple, for minutes until cardiac arrest if they didn't get fluids in fast enough. The clock was already running. Laura didn't remember moving. Muscle memory was a living thing, and hers woke up. She was at the medication cart. Her hands moved through the cabinet with absolute precision. 14-gauge angiocath. 2 of them. She passed one to Dr. Chen without being asked. The young resident didn't even look up, she just took it, recognized the gauge, and threaded it into the subclavian vein on the first attempt because sometimes skill finds skill and knows it. 1 gram TXA, now, Laura said to nobody and everybody. The charge nurse moved immediately. Laura was already moving to monitor 2, where Hargrove was still adjusting his chest tube, still missing something obvious because he wasn't listening to what the body was saying. The O2 sat on monitor 1, 79%. Hargrove turned to her. "We have this under control," he said, his voice carrying an edge that sounded like a warning. Laura said nothing. She was looking at the soldier's chest wall, at the asymmetrical rise and fall, at the way the left side wasn't expanding properly. The tube was in the wrong place. The pneumothorax was still compressing the lung, and the young man's oxygen was dropping because the blood was still pooling, because nothing was where it needed to be. She'd done this before. In Helmand Province in 2017, she'd done this with a Reboa catheter in the parking lot while mortars fell like hail. She'd done this in a convoy when the medic ahead of her took shrapnel and stopped breathing. She'd done this 47 times in 14 months of a deployment that had ended when the screaming in her sleep became impossible to hide. The desert smell hit her suddenly, copper and dust and burning diesel. The tile beneath her feet became sand, red and absorbing. The monitors became the heartbeat of a compound in Sanjan Valley, the beeping becoming the sound of incoming rounds walking across the roof. One of the soldiers had a tattoo on his shoulder, a rocker with a number. 3rd Battalion. 5th Marines. She blinked. The desert was gone. Hargrove was staring at her. The residents had stopped moving. Dr. Chen was looking at her hands. The O2 sat 75% on monitor 1. 72 on monitor 2. That tube is in the wrong place, Laura said quietly. Her voice had changed, the tone flattened, the accent sharpening, something underneath the words that hadn't been there before. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a request. Step back. Hargrove didn't move. Now, Doctor. He stepped back. Her hands moved. The needle for decompression, inserted at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The hiss of air escaping, pressure releasing, the young soldier's chest wall shifting back to symmetry. The oxygen climbed, 78, 82, 88, 91%. The room had gone so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. She looked at Dr. Chen, still working the second line. Push the TXA, then get me type O negative. 2 units. Run it through the rapid infuser. Who are you giving orders? Hargrove's voice was tight. Laura didn't answer. She was already repositioning the first soldier's tube, already checking placement, already assessing blood loss and calculating the transfusion protocols in a part of her brain that never really left Helmand Province. The charge nurse was moving. The residents were moving. Dr. Chen was already running the units. The monitors stabilized. Both soldiers had sinus rhythm. Both had oxygen saturation climbing. The young Marine's eyes found hers for one moment, a moment of recognition, gratitude, something deeper than words. Hargrove stood at the edge of the trauma bay, his jaw working, his expensive watch catching light on trembling wrists. His competence had failed. His authority had been overridden. And standing in front of him, moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had kept people alive on battlefields, was a nurse he'd been systematically destroying. The intercom crackled again. All code blue personnel, the patient is stable. Excellent work, ER team. But that wasn't the worst part. The shift ended at 11:48 p.m., and Laura Bennett moved through Mercy General's corridors with the same quiet efficiency she'd carried for 7 years, 11 in another life, but she didn't count those anymore. The ER had been manageable tonight. 3 minor lacerations, 1 diabetic patient in crisis, a woman with chest pain who turned out to be anxiety. Nothing that required the parts of her she kept locked away in that trunk in her apartment, buried under jumper cables and a tired jack. The worn combat boots stayed there. They belonged to someone else now. Someone she wasn't anymore. Houston's late-night humidity hit her like a wall as she stepped into the parking lot, the kind of thick air that made breathing feel deliberate. The fluorescent lights above the entrance cast everything in that sickly yellow-green that hospitals specialized in. She'd driven past the 24-hour grocery store on Richmond Avenue 100 times. Tonight she needed milk, coffee, something simple. Normalcy in a plastic basket. Her apartment was quiet enough without adding her own thoughts to the silence. The store was nearly empty at this hour. A handful of late-night shoppers drifted between aisles like ghosts. Laura pushed a cart toward the dairy section, her mind already on whether she had enough for tomorrow's shift. 12-hour rotation. Trauma unit. She could manage that. She could manage anything as long as no one looked too closely at the scars on her hands or asked about the way she moved. The elderly man collapsed without warning near the milk cooler, 1 second upright, the next crumpled on the linoleum like someone had cut his strings. His body convulsed once, then went rigid. 70-something, wearing a faded Vietnam veteran baseball cap. Laura heard someone scream. Heard the shuffle of feet as other shoppers backed away, the universal movement of people who didn't want to be involved. She was already moving. The cart dropped where it stood. 3 seconds to reach him. Her hands found his airway, tilted his chin, checked for obstructions, muscle memory taking over before thought could intervene. No pulse. Not breathing. The store's fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song as she looked up at the gathering crowd. Call 911. Now. Someone, she said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming something different. Something that sounded like commands. You or the man in the blue shirt. Move those people back. Create space. Go. He moved. They all did. She positioned him on his back, proper spinal alignment, cleared the area around his chest. Her fingers found the landmarks, 2 fingers above the xiphoid process, heel of her hand centered on the sternum. CPR wasn't complicated if you understood the physics of it. Compressions at 110 beats per minute. Depth of 2 inches, full recoil. The ribs had to be broken to save the heart. Compressions only until EMS arrives, she called out, already settling into the rhythm. 30 compressions. The elderly man's chest caved under her palms. Bone density loss from age, probably osteoporosis, but the goal wasn't to be gentle. The goal was to push blood through a dead organ. 1, 2, 3. The store's tile floor was cold beneath her knees. An army ranger in his late 20s stood frozen 6 feet away, an old man beside him, the patient's son, probably, by the resemblance. The ranger's hands were already positioned on the patient's torso, ready to take over, but something in the way Laura's shoulders moved, the angle of her elbows, the clinical precision of her hand placement, made him stop mid-breath. She didn't see his face. Didn't need to. She felt the weight of his stare, the sudden absence of his movement. Keep going. Count for me, Laura said to him, not breaking rhythm. Out loud. His voice came out strangled. That's combat medic technique. That's, where did you serve? Laura's hands kept moving. Compressions were life. Everything else was secondary. 30 compressions, 2 fingers on the carotid artery to check, no pulse yet, keep going. The Army Ranger's question hung in the stale grocery store air like a rope thrown into a well. 31, 32, she continued the count herself, her breathing controlled, 1 measured exhale between each thrust. Her eyes met his for exactly 1 second. A tear slipped free, not sadness, something else, something she couldn't afford to name, and she wiped it away with the back of her wrist without breaking rhythm. I didn't, she said quietly. Count with me. 33. 34. But the question had already changed something in the store's atmosphere. Other staff members had gathered. A manager, Hargrove, his name tag read, descended from an office above the produce section, his face already darkening as he took in the scene. Laura Bennett, kneeling on his floor, hands moving with a kind of authority that didn't match her hospital transfer paperwork or her carefully constructed anonymity. Stop, Hargrove said, not loud, but the kind of stop that belonged to men who expected obedience. Laura didn't slow. Compressions didn't pause for authority figures. I said stop. You're creating a liability. You're interfering with store operations. Step away. The elderly man was still clinically dead. His pupils fixed and dilated. Maybe 14 minutes without perfusion, depending on when he actually collapsed. The ranger's son stood with his hands clenched, watching his father's body under this stranger's hands. 60 compressions, Laura said, her voice carrying the weight of someone accustomed to being heard in chaos. 1 minute cycle. Check carotid pulse, femoral pulse if necessary. Keep compressions going until EMS arrives. Time is perfusion. I'm not asking you again. Hargrove's voice had taken on that edge, the one that said he wasn't used to being ignored. He was a tall man, carrying his authority in the set of his shoulders. You're practicing medicine without a license on private property. Step away. Laura didn't step away. She didn't stop. She continued compressions, her posture unchanged, her breathing controlled. One measured breath between every series of thrusts. In 7 years of hiding, she'd learned that the most powerful response to a threat was to continue doing what mattered. Your employee can take over, she said, not looking at him. Hands on the sternum, 2 inches depth, full recoil, 110 compressions per minute. Are you trained? There was a younger store employee hovering at the edge of the crowd, name tag reading markers. He nodded, but his hands were shaking. He'd never done this before. Laura could see it in the way he was already calculating depth, already second-guessing himself. Hargrove stepped forward and physically positioned himself between Laura and the patient. Marcus, you're up. This woman is leaving. He's in cardiac arrest, the Army Ranger said, his voice tight. She knows what she's doing. Sir, you need to let her. I don't need anything from you. Hargrove's eyes were on Laura now, and something cold had entered them. Something that went beyond store policy. Something personal. You heard me. Leave. Now. The sirens were still 3 minutes out. Laura could hear them in the distance, that rising wail that meant time was moving in only one direction. Marcus took over compressions, but his technique was already failing, too shallow, hesitant, the ribs weren't moving. The blood wasn't flowing. Laura stood, her knees aching, her hands wet. She looked at Hargrove directly for the first time. One measured breath. Her eyes were the color of something that had seen too much, something that had made decisions in dust and blood and had learned to live with the weight of those decisions. His carotid pulse is absent, she said quietly. He has maybe 2 minutes before organ death becomes irreversible. Your employee is performing compressions at 60 per minute. He'll need 80 at minimum to achieve adequate cerebral perfusion. That patient will not wake up. Hargrove's face reddened. That's not your. I'm aware of what's mine and what isn't. The sirens grew louder. The store seemed to shrink around them, the brightness of the fluorescent lights, the cold linoleum, the smell of antiseptic and produce and the particular staleness of late-night commerce. Laura stepped back as requested. The Army Ranger watched her move away from the patient with an expression that looked like loss. The paramedics arrived at 11:54 p.m., and they took one look at the situation and immediately began their own assessment. One of them, a woman with sergeant's insignia on her sleeve, glanced at Laura's posture, at the way she stood at the edge of the crowd with her hand still extended at her sides, and something in her face shifted. You, the paramedic asked. Laura didn't answer. She didn't need to. The paramedic nodded to her partner, and they took over with the kind of precision that only came from having seen similar situations 100 times. The patient was loaded into the ambulance 3 minutes later, his heart finally achieving sinus rhythm somewhere around the ambulance bay. 30% chance of meaningful recovery. Maybe less, depending on how long the brain had gone without blood. Hargrove was already on his phone, stepping into the corner of the store, his voice low and urgent. Making calls. Activating something. Laura could read it in the set of his shoulders. This wasn't over. This was only beginning. The Army Ranger approached her as the paramedics were loading the patient. His grandfather was with them, riding in the ambulance, one hand on his father's chest as if he could hold him there through sheer force of will. Thank you, he said simply. I don't know who you are, but... Just a nurse, Laura said, and the words felt hollow in her mouth. He studied her face for a long moment. No. You're not. The elderly man's chest stopped rising. Not pausing. Not shallow. Stopped. His lips turned the color of old bruises, and his eyes rolled back like marbles disappearing into his skull. The fluorescent lights of the produce section suddenly felt too bright, too clinical for a place that sold avocados and rotisserie chicken. Hargrove's employee, a kid no older than 22 with a name tag that read Marcus, was already on his knees, hands positioned on the man's sternum. But his compressions were wrong. All wrong. Too fast. Panicked. Shallow. The kind of CPR that looked dramatic but moved almost no blood. His shoulders were tense so high they nearly touched his ears, and his breathing was ragged as he counted out loud, his voice cracking on every number. Laura stood 3 feet away, her shopping basket still in her left hand. Milk. Bread. Coffee. The mundane groceries of a nurse who wanted nothing more than invisibility. The old man's chest rose unevenly. One side inflated. The other side, nothing. His neck veins distended like ropes. His skin began taking on a grayish tint around the lips and fingernails, and his breathing became a strangled wheeze that sounded like wind through broken machinery. Tension pneumothorax. She knew it the way her body knew how to breathe. Air trapped between the lung and the chest wall. Pressure collapsing the lung. Cutting off blood return to the heart. For minutes until cardiac arrest. Maybe 5 if he was lucky. Hargrove stood over them, arms folded, watching with the expression of a man watching a sporting event. Marcus is handling it. We don't need another healthcare professional interfering with private property operations. Laura set her basket down. Slowly. Her movements were economical, precise. She stepped forward. I said. Hargrove moved to block her. She went through his arm like it wasn't there. Like he was furniture. The motion was so smooth, so utterly without hesitation, that for a moment Hargrove stood frozen with his outstretched hand still extended into empty space. Get me a sterilized syringe, she said to Marcus, her voice lower now. Grounded. 14 or 16 gauge. Insulin syringe works. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. I need it now. Marcus's hands stopped moving. I'm trained in CPR. You are. You're doing great. Keep your hands on his chest. Don't stop compressions. She was already moving toward the pharmacy counter at the back of the store, her eye scanning shelves with the precision of someone reading a map she'd memorized years ago. The insulin needles are here. Standard stock location. An elderly woman in the cereal aisle gasped. A teenager with a shopping cart froze mid-step. The pharmacy tech recognized something in Laura's face and didn't ask questions. Just handed over a sealed syringe packet. Laura tore it open with her teeth, didn't hesitate, positioned the needle at the exact point where the second rib met the collarbone on the man's right side. Still compressions, Marcus. She felt for the landmarks beneath his skin, the anatomical cathedral that never changed, that she could navigate in darkness. The needle went through skin with a whisper of resistance. Through muscle. Through pleura. Then the hiss. The beautiful, terrible hiss of air escaping under pressure. The sound of a life being returned. The old man's chest color shifted. The gray faded. His oxygen saturation didn't have a monitor here, but his lips began returning to human pink. His breathing eased. The strangled wheeze became something almost normal. His eyes fluttered open. Keep compressions going, Laura said. Ambulance is already called. What's his name? Robert, someone said. Robert Casey. Robert, you're okay. You're breathing. We've got you. She placed her hand on his shoulder, and for just a moment, a fraction of a second, he gripped her wrist. His eyes focused on hers with a kind of recognition that came from shared survival. From war. From watching other people breathe. From being trained to keep breathing even when every system was failing. His lips moved. Nothing came out but a whisper that might have been a name, Might have been a call sign, might have been her rank from a life she'd buried so deep she didn't answer to it anymore. She pulled her hand away. The ambulance arrived with the kind of efficiency that only emergency services could manage. 17 minutes from collapse to transport. The paramedics took over with practiced efficiency, loading Robert onto a stretcher with the care of professionals who understood they were moving someone's father, someone's husband, someone's reason to keep going. Hargrove descended from his office, his face carefully arranged into an expression of managerial concern. But his eyes were different. Harder. She'd seen that look before in the faces of officers who realized something had shifted. Something they couldn't control. "Miss Bennett," he said, his voice pitched for the crowd that had gathered. "A word in my office." She knew what was coming. Somehow, she'd always known. The office was small and smelled like expensive cologne and something sour underneath it. Hargrove sat behind his desk. Laura remained standing. "You performed an invasive medical procedure on private property without proper authorization," he said. His words were careful, rehearsed. "Needle decompression is a surgical intervention. You're not a physician. You're not even licensed to perform advanced life support procedures in a retail environment." "He would have died in 4 minutes," Laura said quietly. "That's not the point. The point is liability. The point is that you violated multiple regulations, and now Mercy General Hospital is going to have questions about your background, your credentials, and why you felt qualified to perform procedures you have no authority to perform." She watched him make the call from the store's back office. She heard him use terms like rogue practitioner and aggressive intervention and unknown qualifications. She saw him hang up and make a second call, then a third. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. An email from HR administrative leave effective immediately. "Return your badge and ID." It took 48 hours. The investigation moved fast. Too fast. Like something that had been wound up and waiting for the moment to release. Hargrove had called board members. He'd contacted references he shouldn't have known about. He'd somehow obtained her personnel file from the VA system, records that were supposed to be sealed, and had made quiet inquiries about why a nurse with a spotty employment history and 17 transfers across military and civilian hospitals was practicing medicine in Houston. Laura's badge was confiscated on a Thursday morning. Her access to the hospital system was revoked by Thursday afternoon. By Friday, the disciplinary notice was posted. By Saturday, she was sitting in a waiting room at the VA hospital downtown. The rain outside came down in sheets, hammering the windows with the sound of thousands of tiny fists. The waiting room smelled like old coffee and antiseptic and something underneath that she recognized as fear. The fear that came from survival. From knowing what your body could endure. From sitting in clinics waiting for people in white coats to confirm what you already knew, that the war never really ended. The man next to her was missing his left arm below the shoulder. The woman across from her had scars on her visible skin that suggested blast radius. An older veteran in the corner had the shakes of someone whose nervous system was still operating on high alert, still expecting incoming. Laura had treated veterans like this. Had trained them. Had held their hands while their bodies decided whether to keep fighting or surrender to the damage. Now she was one of them. Her cardboard box of belongings from her locker sat on the chair beside her. Combat boots at the bottom. The photograph that had arrived anonymously at the hospital 3 months ago, the one she'd never reported, never mentioned to anyone, tucked into the side pocket. A photograph of her own face, rank insignia visible, from a classified operation in Helmand Province that officially never happened. Someone knew. Someone had found her. And now she'd lost everything while saving someone. Her phone had stopped ringing by Saturday. The calls went to voicemail. The texts went unanswered. Her sister hadn't replied to her messages because Laura had never told her where she was in the first place. Anonymity had been the entire point. Disappear into civilian life. Stop being Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett. Stop remembering the faces of the 17 Marines she'd pulled out of the Sanjin Valley. Stop hearing the sound of amputations made without anesthesia. Stop being the woman who'd learned to move through a combat zone as if she were death herself. The rain continued to fall. She reached into the cardboard box and pulled out the combat boots. They were worn through at the heel. The leather was cracked in places where her feet had learned to walk through desert and mud and snow and blood. The laces were different colors because she'd replaced them 100 times. The soles held the memory of every mile. She held them in both hands and considered walking to the trash receptacle outside the waiting room. Just leaving them there. Letting go of the last physical connection to that life. A woman 3 chairs down coughed. The sound was wet and painful, the cough of someone whose lungs had been compromised by exposure to something the government would never admit existed. Laura knew that cough. She'd heard it in 100 waiting rooms. She'd heard it in her own chest during her initial intake here. She pulled the boots back to her lap and held them like they were sacred. Because they were. The waiting room clock read 3:16 a.m. Nobody came in. Nobody came out. The rain hammered on without rhythm or mercy. And somewhere in the darkness above the hospital, in the space between the storm clouds and the city lights, Laura heard something that made her look up. A sound. Not thunder. Not wind. Something mechanical. Something that made every veteran in the waiting room suddenly go still and listen. The sound of distant rotors. The sound of a helicopter. The sound of someone coming. 3 days later, the elderly man transferred to Mercy General. His name was James Whitmore. 73 years old. 2 tours in Helmand Province. The kind of veteran who taught the young ones how to survive. Laura didn't know any of this when she arrived to clear out her locker under security escort. She didn't know his son was a Marine colonel. She didn't know the file folder that son was reading in the hallway outside room for 12 contained the complete military record that security had finally retrieved from the Pentagon at the request of hospital administration, a routine inquiry that turned into something no one expected. Colonel Marcus Whitmore stood in that corridor at 2:36 p.m. on a Thursday, and his hands began to tremble as he read. Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett, he said aloud, his voice steady despite the tremor in his fingers. The file crinkled. Navy Cross recipient for extracting 17 wounded Rangers under direct fire in Helmand Province, personally performing field amputations that saved for lives. He turned the page. A photograph fell out. Laura in dress blues, 2012. Hair tied back. Eyes the color of slate water after a storm. Before she disappeared. The hallway went dead silent. A nurse walking past froze. 2 residents stopped mid-conversation. Someone's pump beeped once, twice, and nobody moved to silence it. Colonel Whitmore kept reading, his voice cracking like old leather. 2 Purple Hearts. Silver Star. Combat Medic certification at the level of instructor-trainer. He looked up from the file. Looked toward the end of the corridor where a woman in a cardigan sweater was turning a locker key. A woman with hollow eyes and the kind of posture that comes from carrying weight nobody could see. Laura knew. The moment the silence changed frequency, she knew. The hospital CEO arrived within 4 minutes. Then the rear admiral. Then the full cascade, boots on tile, rank collars catching fluorescent light, dress uniforms appearing in the doorway like uniforms appearing means the world has just shifted on its axis. The rear admiral's name was Patricia Graves, and she carried herself like someone who'd stood on the bridge of a destroyer. She moved to Laura with one hand extended, and her voice filled the corridor with the kind of authority that doesn't need to be loud. Senior Chief Bennett. Not a question. Not a greeting. A recognition. Rear Admiral Patricia Graves, Naval Station Norfolk. I've come personally because what I'm about to say should be witnessed. The hallway filled. Nurses emerged from patient rooms. The board members who'd authorized Laura's termination 48 hours earlier stepped out of the administration office and froze. Dr. Hargrove was among them, his face already draining of color because he understood what the uniforms meant. The rear admiral continued. The personnel file you've just been relieved of contains several commendations that should never have been sealed. Silver star. 2 purple hearts. A bronze star with Valor. These are facts. She paused. The air pressure changed. 17 Rangers came home because of your work. 4 of them walked without prosthetics because of your hands. This hospital will add your name to the memorial wall today. This is not a discussion. The board members stared. The nurses stared. Hargrove's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from dark water. What you all need to understand, the Rear Admiral said, turning to face the gathered staff, is that Senior Chief Bennett voluntarily left active service. She made that choice. She came to Houston for reasons that are hers alone. She took a job as a nurse because that's what Senior Chief Bennett does, she heals. That career at the grocery store wasn't a violation of protocol. That was a combat-trained medic doing exactly what her training demands she do when someone's dying in front of her. Her eyes moved to Hargrove. Which brings me to why I'm here, and why these federal investigators are about to walk through that door. The words hung like a blade suspended. Hargrove's face transformed. Not red. Not angry. White. The color of someone watching their entire narrative dissolve in real time. His lips moved but nothing came out. His hand reached for the wall to steady himself. The supply chain billing irregularities he'd counted on staying buried, the $847,000 in equipment that was never delivered to the hospital, the kickback arrangement with that medical supplier, the false documentation he'd created to justify the purchases, all of it suddenly visible. All of it because he'd needed Laura gone so badly that he'd accelerated his pattern, and in trying to destroy a nurse, he'd created a paper trail the federal government could follow with their eyes closed. The door at the end of the corridor opened. 3 federal investigators in dark jackets and badges that caught the light like instruments. They moved with the fluid precision of people who've done this 1,000 times before. One of them walked directly to Hargrove and said, "Dr. Gerald Hargrove, we have a warrant to seize financial records related to equipment procurement for this facility from 2019 to present. Please step away from the administrative office." It wasn't a request. It was a command, delivered the way commands are delivered when there's no room for negotiation. The security guard who'd escorted Laura out 3 days ago, the one who'd held her badge and her dignity in his hands and handed them both away, he was standing at the end of the hallway now. He watched Hargrove being led toward the administrative office. He watched the federal investigators begin opening file cabinets. Then he walked to Hargrove's office and retrieved a cardboard box. He walked back to where Hargrove stood, shoulders collapsing, and he handed it over without a word. "I believe you know the way out," the guard said. The words were quiet. They destroyed everything. Hargrove left Mercy General at 3:16 p.m. He carried that cardboard box. His phone rang twice and he didn't answer. His car was in spot C47 in the parking lot. The security cameras recorded him sitting in the driver's seat for 11 minutes, just staring at the steering wheel. Then he drove out of the lot slowly, like someone driving toward something he could see but didn't want to reach. The federal investigators worked until 8:44 p.m. They seized every document related to equipment procurement. They photographed every receipt. They downloaded every email. By the time they left, they had enough evidence for felony fraud charges. Enough for embezzlement. Enough for false billing to federal Medicare programs, which meant the case automatically escalated to the Department of Justice level. 6 months later, Dr. Gerald Hargrove taught CPR certification at a community college in southeast Houston, the kind of place where the walls smelled like industrial cleaner and broken dreams. His name tag read Gerald. He flinched when anyone called him doctor. His hands shook during the chest compression demonstrations. The students didn't know what he'd been before. That was fine. He'd never be that again. But Laura knew where her boots belonged now. She stood in her apartment that night, alone, and pulled them from the top shelf of her closet where she'd finally placed them, not hidden in a trunk anymore, not shoved behind winter clothes, but displayed like something that mattered. The leather was cracked from 3,847 miles of patrol operations. The laces were still stained with dust from Helmand Province. The rubber soles were worn smooth from running toward people who were dying. She touched them once. Her hands didn't shake. 2 weeks later, she stood at a podium at the Houston VA hospital. She wore her navy dress blues. The uniform fit exactly as it had 12 years ago, because the spine that uniform hangs on doesn't change, it only gets tested. Behind her stood the wall of names. Veterans who hadn't made it home. Veterans who'd come home but lost the way back. "My name is Laura Bennett," she said into the microphone. "I'm a senior chief petty officer, and I'm here because the VA is launching a new combat trauma program. I'm the director. We're trained to understand what happens to your mind when you've held people together who were falling apart. We're trained to understand why coming home feels harder than being there." She paused. The room held its breath. I spent 5 years running from that understanding. 5 years trying to be invisible. That doesn't work. So I'm here to tell you, you don't have to run. You don't have to hide. There are people here who've been where you are. We're waiting. We know the way back. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The restraint it takes to stand up and say your name after you've spent so long trying to forget it. The restraint it takes to step back into the fight, this time for people instead of against them. Not all heroes wear capes, some wear scrubs. Did you know that 22 veterans attempt suicide every single day in this country? 22. If you're watching this and you're carrying that weight, there's a number you can call. The Veterans Crisis Line. 188, then press 1. Call it at 2 a.m. Call it at 3 in the afternoon. They answer. They know. Subscribe for more stories about the people who save us when the world stops watching.